Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I wanted to share with you my favorite decks that I worked with in 2019. So I thought we'd just take a look through my journals. We'll go month by month, and I'll tell you about the favorite tarot and oracle decks that I used each month. I actually had a fairly rough start to my 2019. For the first few months of the year, I was very sick, so I didn't get a chance to do much in the way of tarot or journaling, which, you know, if you've watched some of my other journaling videos, you've probably seen that it's pretty sparse at the beginning of the month. So I didn't work with many decks the first few months of the year. In January, I did primarily work with my Tarot of the She. Now this is my trimmed version now. So this was not trimmed at the time I was working with it, but I have since trimmed it, which I recently just did a video on my channel. So I took it down to just the artwork, but this is actually one of my favorite decks. It's so powerful. I love the deep messages that I get with it, and it's just a fantastic reader for me. And honestly, I like it a lot trimmed, and I do read with it in conjunction with some other decks. But for that particular month, I had paired it with the Shamanic Healing Oracle, which is again another one of my favorite decks. But these two actually worked really well together because you had these fairly detailed, busy images, but they're very raw and very primal, and you pair that with the raw and primal but simple images of the shamanic medicine, and you just get these wonderful messages between the two. It's even not so bad now that I've trimmed it. I have actually thought about trimming this deck because it has the shiny gold gilding that I don't love, but it's actually not too bad on this deck. But I do actually really like the keywords, so that's the main reason why I haven't trimmed it. So those were the two decks that I used in January that I really enjoyed. I believe for the most part, they were the only two decks that I used in January. So it was primarily a month of Tarot of the She and the Shamanic Healing. So moving into February, February was the worst month for me health-wise, and I spent most of the month working with the Tarot of Transformation. I did a really deep dive into this deck. I studied the guidebook. I worked with each card individually. This process actually lasted into March as well, and I also started working on studying a different deck in March as well, which we'll get to here in a minute. But for me, this was a very healing deck, and it really came for me at just the right time in the year when I really needed to step into that healing mindset. I needed to heal my body, and this was a wonderful deck for connecting to that healing in all manners. So for me, this is very much a healing of the whole self, of body, heart, mind, and soul all together into one, and this deck works beautifully for it. I do want to trim it, I just haven't gotten around to doing that yet. So that was the deck that I worked pretty much exclusively with in February. That was the Tarot of Transformation. So moving into March, I was starting to feel better. I did work primarily with the Tarot of Transformation. Again, I was still working on that for healing. I had paired that a little bit with the Botanical Inspirations here and there. That was just a deck that I was just pulling on its own. But primarily, I started working with my Moonchild Tarot during this time. So I actually created a journal specifically for this. I do have a whole video on this. This is how I go about studying my tarot decks. So for the month of March, I started my Moonchild study, and you can see here that I've done quite a bit of work with this deck. I have gone through all of the cards. I have read the guidebook. I have studied everything. I've done path working with this deck. I have done exercises with this deck. I've done spreads with this deck. So I put a lot of time and effort into the Moonchild, and that was a deck that I worked primarily with in March because I was studying it. That also carried over into April, which you'll definitely see in my journal if you watched that journaling video. I actually really enjoyed working with this deck way more than I thought I was going to. At the time I bought it, I was like, I don't do collage decks. I don't like collage decks. Since then, I actually have quite a few collage decks now. There are a few cards in this deck that really completely missed the mark for me and that are not really my favorite. This is kind of one of them, but There are a lot of this cards in this deck that do really work really well for me, and primarily I like the way that this deck reads. I do have to say the court is not my favorite. They are far too young for my tastes, but I mean, if the courts are all look like they're in their 20s, and to me that works fine for a page and a knight, but not so much for my queens and kings. It's just personal preference. But you get some of these really beautiful, almost pippish minors, which I really like. And then the majors, for the most part, are really beautiful in this deck. And it's a wonderfully produced deck. I mean, everybody talks about this deck in terms of the cardstock. It's got the lovely gilding. To be perfectly honest with you, this deck is too big for me. I'm not fond of this super thick cardstock. I prefer thinner cardstock because I can shuffle it. I can handle it better. But it's a beautiful deck, and I really enjoyed working with it. I love the color palette. I mean, look at that. It's so beautiful. So this was definitely a deck that I enjoyed working with. It's a deck that I enjoyed diving deep into and really studying. And it kind of was the catalyst for reminding me that I do enjoy that deep study work with decks, and that's really how I get to know them and how I connect with them. So that was the deck that I used primarily in March, and that was the Moonchild Tarot. So moving into April, I was actually starting to feel a lot better, so I did quite a bit more journaling. I worked with some great decks in April. My plant is in the way. One of my favorite pairings that I did is the Victorian Romantic Tarot, which I am sorry to say is out of print, I believe, at this moment, and that's not really my favorite to show out of print decks on my channel, but I do want to show you the decks that I really enjoyed working with. So these are definitely two of my favorite decks, and it's always exciting when I get to work with two of my favorite decks together. But these two decks just have a wonderful conversation between them, because you have this kind of more down-to-earth, kind of more realistic a little bit, perhaps even, you know, a bit romanticized view of life. And then you have this really dreamy, mystical kind of fantasy aspect that really creates a beautiful conversation between reality and fantasy. And I think that it really helps to balance each other out, and they really pick up on some nuances in between each other. And it just makes for beautiful readings. These are definitely two decks that I love. You can see here we have the Three of Swords, which I associate as growth of the mind. And we have this lovely image with the balloon that's, you know, taking the palace off into, you know, into the new realm. So it's growing, it's moving on, and I think that's really lovely when they pair like that together. So definitely two of my favorite decks, and I really enjoyed working with them both. So that is the Victorian Romantic Tarot and the Oracle of the Mystical Moments. So the other two decks that were really stand out for me in April were my Hudes Tarot and my Illuminated Earth Oracle. And I do want to say the Hudes Tarot is out of print. Again, sorry to show that, but I really do. It's a deck that I really do love, and I really enjoyed working with it. The messages between these two were really wonderful. I love what this happens. The moon and the moon. The color palettes between the two are really compatible, and they look beautiful together when they're laid out either in pairings like this or in full readings. They just look gorgeous together. So here we have the Ten of Swords and fertility. What's gonna grow from this death here? I think that's just really wonderful. They're just beautiful together. I did use the Hudes Tarot quite a bit in the beginning of the year too. I forgot to mention that, because I was working on, look, healing. That's what I was working on. And for me, this was actually a very healing deck as well. I don't know if it's just because it happened to come at that time in my life, or because it just has a very healing nature for me, but these two together are absolutely beautiful. So that's the Illuminated Earth Oracle and the Hudes Tarot. So moving into May, this was a pretty good month for me. It's also my birthday month, so I did actually get quite a few decks, and I did work with quite a few wonderful decks. I almost pulled the Fairy Tale Tarot and the Winged Enchantment out to show, because I think these work wonderfully together, but as well as the Moonchild and the Sacred Creator. But if I went through every pairing that I did throughout the year, this would be a really long video. You can see all of these in my reflection videos as well. The main deck that I got in May, which was super exciting for me, was the Roots and Wings Oracle. And since I have used it pretty much every month since, and I've used it for a lot of readings. It came with a garden spread. I went ahead and did that. I worked with some other great decks. I used it in conjunction with the Mesquite Tarot, which I do actually really like the Mesquite Tarot, but it's a little bit slippery and it's a little bit hard for me to work with, and it is out of print now, so I was trying to keep those down to a minimum. But the last week in May, I actually worked with the Roots and Wings with the Dreaming Way, and the Dreaming Way is one of my it's one of my older decks, and it's actually one of my favorites too, because I absolutely adore the artwork. And I've trimmed mine down, and of course I've edged it in green, and it is just a wonderful little deck, and I love the way it paired with the Roots and Wings. The art style is kind of has a it's a very compatible art style, so they look really wonderful together. So here we have the Nine of Pentacles and the Dreamer, the Ten of Pentacles and Perseverance. The messages were just really wonderful between these two decks, the Lovers and Abundance. I mean, I love when this happens. The Devil and the Voice. How powerful is that? It just, yeah. Death and Seasons. Everything comes to an end, right? Everything dies. The wheel keeps on turning. It's just the High Priestess and the Moon. Sometimes I forget how much I love doing this. Here we have the Moon and Hope. So, you know, I could sit here and probably flip through this whole deck, and we would probably get a fantastic message with each flip through. And that's one of the things that I really like about both of these decks, is they are very consistent readers for me. I love the artwork in both, and I just really enjoy the messages that these two have to share with each other. So I definitely have used them again for other readings, but they were two of my favorites in the month of May. So in June, I worked with a lot of great decks again. There was the Sasarabito, Oracle of Echoes, Influence of Angels, Divine Doors, you know, some of my favorites. But some of my standouts decks for this month were the Wooden Tarot and the Earthbound Oracle. Now, I believe that I might have gotten these in June or at the end of May. So they were new to me at the time, and I've used them multiple times since. The Earthbound Oracle in particular I tend to use a lot, but these are two decks by the same creator, and they do go really well together. I love the messages between them, but they also work really well in conjunction with other tarot and oracle decks, and sometimes those are my favorite pairings, even though they were kind of created to go together. I actually like to mix them up. But they are just, here we have the Five of Plumes and Failure. I mean, the messages between them, they really were meant to go together. They read wonderfully together. Here we have the Wheel of Fortune and Reflect. It's just, they're just so beautiful. They are both very surreal, kind of dreamy-like, but they definitely do have a very kind of groundy and ruthy energy to them. Despite that. So I think that's really wonderful. And I absolutely adore both of these decks. They're just two of my favorites. I use both of them quite often. So that is the Wooden Tarot and the Earthbound Oracle. So another two decks that I worked with quite a bit in June, and I actually did them for other readings, not like bigger readings, not just my normal daily draw. I used the Darkness of Light Tarot, which is one of my favorite tarot decks. It's a very consistent reader for me. And I paired that with the Earthbound Oracle. And these two together are just, yeah, they tell a fantastic story. So here we have the Eight of Cups and Healing. There is just something about these two decks that really pull those deeper inner messages out from each other, and I think that it's really wonderful. So here we have the Emperor and Time. You know, the Page of Cups with Growth. It's just so much fun. The Eight of Blades and Toxic. This is another one that I could just sit and do this, you know, all day long. Here's Justice and Illuminate. And if you've never just sat here and stacked your decks like this and just flipped cards and looked for the message, just look for that quick hit of a message. It's so wonderful. Knight of Wands with the Voice. It's a wonderful exercise, and it's a great way to get to know your decks, and a great way to see if two decks are going to pair well together for you, because you can see the conversation that they're going to have. If it's going to be there, it's going to be there, and it's going to be there right from the get-go. And sometimes these pairings don't work out very well. So It's always really exciting when you find two decks that converse with each other so well. It's like they were almost meant to be a pair. And these two I do use quite often together. Visually, they also look stunning. You have the darker palette of the Darkness of Light. This is, I believe, the second edition, which is not currently out. I think they're on a different edition. The third has white borders, which doesn't seem to thrill a lot of people, but I have heard rumor that they're going to be releasing another edition before too terribly long. So, but you pair that dark, you know, kind of really earthy color palette with the lighter background and the same similar earthy color palette of the Earthbound Oracle. It's just beautiful. The Queen of Blades with balance. Just gorgeous. Three of Blades with wisdom. The wisdom that comes from that growth. I love this Three of Swords. It's beautiful. So yeah, just another two wonderful pairings. That is the Darkness of Light Tarot and the Earthbound Oracle. So moving into July, again, another round of great decks. We did the Santa Muerta and the Roots and Wings, the Pagan Otherworlds, and the Vintage Wisdom. But the one that really kind of stood out to me first and foremost was the, if I can get to it, the Tyldwick Tarot, which I'm sorry, again, out of print. I know, I keep showing out of print decks. This is like the most I've ever shown in one video, and I apologize. But I paired that with the Botanical Inspirations deck, which is a pairing that I got, they stole from Lisa at Supportive Tarot. And these two decks, again, they just feel like they were made for each other. The conversation between them is really wonderful. The Tyldwick Tarot is a very deep and meditative deck for me. And then you pair that with these really kind of simple, understated messages of the Botanical Inspirations. And they just work so well together. So here we have Temperance with Eternal Memories. It's just beautiful. The Four of Cups with Thankfulness for Understanding. The Five of Coins with Enlightenment. I mean, they're just, the pairing between them is just really wonderful. I just, again, love the images, the really deep, meditative, thoughtful imagery of the Tyldwick, and then these beautiful, simplistic, just beautiful flowers and the simple messages of the Botanical Inspirations. They're just beautiful. And I do really like the guidebook for this deck. It's just a little guidebook, but these little inspirational messages are just fabulous in here. And I found myself adding those to my journal quite often when I use this deck. They are just that succinct, I think. But these, again, are just two beautiful, beautiful, beautiful decks. I love the way they work together. The Tyldwick is one of my favorites. Again, I'm so sorry that is out of print. Three of Cups with Majesty and Virtue. Again, this is another one that I could just sit and do this with. So that is the Tyldwick Tarot and the Botanical Inspirations. So the other two decks that really worked well for me in July were the Field Tarot, which is one of my favorite new decks, and the Sacred Creators Oracle. Now, the Sacred Creators often gets paired with the Moonchild. I mean, I often pair it with the Moonchild. I think other people do too. But I really enjoyed it with the Field Tarot as well. I love the simple messages that the Sacred Creators pulls out of the Field Tarot. And the color palettes are just, they go beautifully together. So here we have the Seven of Swords with Fall in Love with Your Own Story. Now, I will say that on the Field Tarot, I do not like the keywords at the bottom, and I'm probably at some point going to chop those off because I just like the titles of the deck, or the titles of the card on there. But here we have the Four of Discs with Integrate Your Knowing. They just work really well together. I mean, here we have the Five of Swords. Your past supports your future. So those challenges that you have faced in the past are going to be what helps you move forward in the future. I just think it's beautiful. Five of Wands, unstick the stuck. I think it's just great. The Hierophant, befriend the word polarize. The two of these together, they're like simple messages. They're simple, they're easy, they're just, and I don't mean easy as in a bad thing. I just mean that they're right there to the point, and it's just wonderful little messages to get you just right where you need to be. So those were two that really stood out for me in July as just being, you know, wonderful, wonderful decks with wonderful messages. So that is the Field Tarot and the Sacred Creators Oracle. Moving into August, I actually had to move into another journal because I filled the other one up, and this one is even more full than the journal from the first of the year. So in August, I worked with a bunch of wonderful decks, Darkness of Light. I did part of the tarot challenge. I didn't actually finish it with the Tarot of the Lucid Slumber. That was really great. I thought about pulling that one out here. Worked with the Wild Offering cards, which I really liked. Worked with the White Sage Tarot, which we're actually going to talk about here in a minute. But one of the decks that I worked with that I was really excited about was the Textured Tarot, because this deck had been in my collection for several months and I had yet to read with it. Like, I think I bought it somewhere around the beginning of the year. Like, I want to say like March, April, somewhere around there. And it took me till August to actually use it. And I paired that with the Hedgewitch Botanical. And the thing I really like about this pairing, besides the fact that I just really love these two decks, is that I love the simplicity of the Hedgewitch Botanical paired with the busier collage artwork of the Textured Tarot. I absolutely adore the artwork of the Textured Tarot. I cannot stand the cardstock. This has no give to it. I mean, I'm not the first one to say it, and I'm hoping, please, please, please come out with a version that is like, throw it up on Make playing cards. Like, that would be fabulous. That's great cardstock I can easily shuffle with. I might be the only one that thinks that, but anyway, I absolutely love working with these images. I just hate working with the deck itself because it's just too big and bulky and it doesn't shuffle, and that's a whole nother thing. But the messages between the two of them, I mean, here we have the Three of Swords with Subdued. It's just, they're so beautiful. The Three of Cups with Nourish. The Queen of Pentacles with Humility. That's a good one, isn't it? Seven of Swords with Nurture. I really like the way they balance each other out. So we have these, you know, busier images with these really detailed, very textured messages coming from this deck. And then we have the very just simple, like, just take a break, calm it down. Here's what you need to know. And I just really love that about it. Page of Pentacles with Ephemeral. It's so beautiful. I love the Page of Pentacles in this deck. The Two of Pentacles with Regenerate. I mean, just gorgeous. Just gorgeous. So that was the Textured Tarot and the Hedgewitch Botanical Oracle. So I do also want to just touch briefly on my little White Sage Tarot in a tin. This is a fantastic little deck. I was actually really kind of surprised by how much I like it. I kind of wish I had the indie version just because. I don't know. I don't really need it. I like a smaller deck, but, you know, I think maybe I want it. Who knows? Anyway, I really love these simple, love the elephants in the Pentacle Court. Absolutely love that. The Court of the Pentacles is my favorite. Anyway, I really enjoy the messages that I received from this deck. I did do some chakra work with it, which this deck is more geared towards chakra work, or I shouldn't say it's geared towards, it's layered in there. And it worked really beautifully for that. So I had just a little bit of a hiccup with the Courts of the Swords and the Wands, because the swords to me are the element of air, and I would normally see birds. That's normally what I picture for birds. And then the wands would be more of that sort of cat energy that we see. But that's just my own personal elemental associations and my own personal references that I make. So, but overall, I just love this simple artwork. It's such a soft, warm, and comforting deck. I really find this deck to be very nurturing, and I really enjoyed working with it. It's actually a deck that I sometimes pull and just will shuffle and pull a card, like not to do a reading, but just to get a simple message. It works really wonderfully for that as well. It's just beautifully produced. So that one is the White Sage Tarot. So in September, I actually kind of ended up working with two decks primarily. The first is the Tarot of the Hidden Realms, because I actually did, we'll come back to this one in a minute, my first like full tarot challenge where I did the Lionheart's Harvest Moon Tarot Challenge, and I used the Tarot of the Hidden Realms for that challenge. And it's just, this deck actually kind of surprised me because I was always, the artwork is beautiful. I've always thought it was beautiful, but I wasn't sure about this real close-up, like intimate interaction with these images. But oh, look how beautiful. The artwork is just so stunning. And this deck, like, it does not mess around. It's a Fae deck, and I think that tends to happen with Fae decks for me, is that they're not like light and fluffy. They take things kind of seriously, and they don't kid around, and they're here to tell you what's up. And I do actually really enjoy that. And I had a really, really great experience working with this deck, especially in terms of the challenge and working with it all month. So it's a deck that kind of surprised me. I've had it for a long time before I worked with it. It was one that I bought because I'm like, oh, everybody loves it. It's so pretty. And then I was like, oh, it's pretty, but I don't know about these, like this is like full on in your face. Turns out I actually do kind of like that. It has definitely a voice of its own, and it's not afraid to, you know, tell me what it thinks. And I think that that's really wonderful. There's another deck that we'll talk about here in a little bit that was similar to that experience. So that was wonderful working with that throughout the month for that tarot challenge. And that is the Tarot of the Hidden Realms. So another deck that I ended up working with quite a bit in September, which surprised me, is the Tarot de St. Croix. This is a deck that I kind of went back and forth on even purchasing, because like some of the cards I really, really like, and some of them really kind of missed the mark for me. And reading the book in some cases really, really helped, and in some cases actually made that connection worse. But overall, I really like this deck. It is a phenomenal reader. I mean, it surprised me how much I liked reading with it. It's kind of a weird mishmash, eclectic thing. I mean, here we have Kali, and then I think I saw it here, we have some like very modern image, like this is one of the creator's sons. And that's one of the things that honestly I had an issue with this deck, is that every time, after reading the book and really studying and working with this deck a lot, every time that there was mention of real people, that throws me off, because when you include somebody real in your deck, now I know that that's a real person, and I have a really hard time connecting with that card in a way that speaks to me personally. But then we have cards like this where we have the moon. These are the towers of the high priestess coming up. It's just so beautiful. Overall, I just really, really enjoyed working with this deck, and it really surprised me. I love this Sun card. And it reads more numerologically, which was a huge thing for me, because that is how I read, and so few decks actually focus on that. And this one does, and it was really wonderful to see that. Love this Knight of Wands. He's so awesome. Love this Queen of Wands. So again, it's a weird kind of a eclectic mix of things in this deck. But it does, like here we have, this is Arthur and the Lady of the Lake handing him the sword. So again, just, you know, and then here we have the Empress. So we have all these cultures that are crossed. We have, you know, modern scenes taking place. We have this throwback to historical scenes in different cultures. I absolutely love the Wheel of Fortune in this deck, and I love the write-up on the Wheel of Fortune in this deck. It's fabulous in the book. I love the Strength card as well. So yeah, this was a deck that actually really surprised me. Love this Hermit too. It's one of my favorite Hermits. She's so beautiful. So yeah, I ended up working with this deck a lot. I used it for like one reading at the beginning of the month, which I think was just my, you know, like a check-in where I'm going reading. And then I just kept coming back to it again and again and again. I think I'm going to trim it. I'm still on the fence, but I think I'm going to trim it and take those orange borders off. They don't really bother me so much. I mean, they really don't bother me a ton, but I just think it would look really cool just down to just the artwork and maybe just the titles at the bottom, but I'm not even sure if I'm going to keep those, because now I've done so much work with this deck. I know all the images. I don't need the titles. And seeing as I don't read professionally, it's not a big deal for me to chop titles off my deck, because if I know them, then that's all I really need. I do actually quite like the backs of them. So that was another surprise deck for me in the month of September, and that was the Tarot de St. Croix. So October was a month of really fun decks too. I worked with the Bohemian Gothic, which if you watch some of my other videos, you know that deck and I we've had some issues coming to terms with working together, but we think we got it figured out now. So we worked with the Flowers of the Night Oracle, the Santa Muerta, the Zombie Tarot, which was a lot of fun, and the Halloween Oracle. But I do have to say that my favorite pairing was the Carnival at the End of the World and the Oracle of Oddities. Now, these were two new decks to me at the time. The Carnival at the End of the World actually surprised me. I didn't think I was going to like it as much as I did. I have since edged it, trimmed it, modified it. I have a whole video on my channel about this, but now it's kind of closer in size to the Oracle of Oddities. But these two decks together, I think I rambled on about this in my October reflections too, so I'm going to try not to ramble a whole lot here, but these two decks kind of blew me away. I was really surprised at the depth of their messages. They, on the surface, seem like two really kind of simple decks. The artwork's very minimalistic. There's not a lot of fuss and fanfare. They're both a little bit on the odd side, but the messages that these two decks provided were really fantastic. Very deep, very soulful, almost spiritual in a way, and that really kind of surprised me. Yeah, two decks that just totally surprised me. Wasn't really surprised that I liked the Oracle of Oddities because I do really like the Antique Anatomy as well, but the Carnival at the End of the World surprised me, and this was gifted to me by the lovely Barbara, and just thank you, Barbara, because I really, really like it. Oh, I also want to do, in case you missed it, when I did my mod of this deck, I mentioned that I was actually missing a card, and I have since heard from the creator, and he's sending me a new one, so I'm excited about that, although I'm going to have to try to trim it and edge it, make sure I get it the same size. So yeah, that was really, really awesome experience with the Carnival at the End of the World and the Oracle of Oddities. If you saw my journal flip through for October, you know that I actually did like quite a bit of work with both of these decks, and that was a lot of fun. So then moving into November, November was an exciting month for me because I had a deck that I created kind of released and came out, and we'll see it here in a minute. I also worked with some fantastic decks in November. So one of my favorites that I worked with was the Modern Spellcasters Tarot. And this is a deck that I think gets overlooked a lot. I don't know if it's the name or... Okay, so that's not my favorite card in the deck, but I love the rest of them. It does switch the association between the swords and the wands, but I don't think that the imagery inhibits you to read it any way that you need to. So this deck I worked with in conjunction with the Lionheart's Retrograde Tarot Challenge. So I basically did my readings all month with the Modern Spellcasters, and it was just so much fun to read with this deck. I love working with this deck. I love the images. I love the messages that I get from it. It's just a lot of fun. I love shuffling it too. I think it's that old Llewellyn cardstock. I'm not really sure, but I like it. I like a thinner cardstock. I really do. It shuffles well. It works beautifully for me. I actually, I didn't do like a mod with me or anything on it, but I did actually edge this deck in the Crayola metallic marker, and I think it came out really well because it matches the backs like perfectly. So I was pretty happy about that. So that was a really fun deck that I enjoyed working with in November, and that's the Modern Spellcasters Tarot. So another deck that I really enjoyed working with in November is the deck that I created. So this is my little rusted Lenormand. I have edged mine in orange, or in this rusted orange color. It does not come this way. So sad, I wish it did, but then I would have to make this an expensive deck. And I wanted it to be super affordable and super available. So it's up on Make Playing Cards. You can just buy a copy and get yourself a little bag or box for it if you want, and away you go. I love this deck. One of the things, of course I love it, I made it, right? How silly is that? Here's the backs. But one of the things that I really focused on in this deck was how I connected to each of the cards of the Lenormand. I really used this deck as a learning tool. So in its creation, I was still learning Lenormand. I'm still learning Lenormand. To be perfectly honest with you, I'm still learning tarot. I've been reading tarot for over 10 years, but I'm still learning tarot. I don't think we ever stop learning. But one of the things that I wanted to do was make a non-gender specific Lenormand deck. So I used, instead of man and woman, I used seeker and partner. And I do have 2 additional significator cards in here so that you can add those in if you need to. But I really focused on a color palette that I like. The bear is one of my favorite cards in this deck. I have a lot of, well, they're all kind of my favorites, right? I created them, so they're all my favorites, let's be honest. But it's just a very kind of simple Lenormand deck, and I wanted it to be very clear, very easy to read, and I just really wanted something with this color palette. Here's the partner card. Love the fox too. I think the fox was the one that actually, I think this was the image that got me started doing this, and then, you know, it's photoshopped and stuff. It's digitally done, but hopefully it's done in a way that, you know, that works for everybody. I love the star card too. That was this, I think, the second card I created maybe. Anyway, yeah, okay. I'm gonna stop gushing about my own deck because that's just kind of ridiculous. But I love this little Lenormand, of course, because I created it. So that is the Rusted Lenormand. So the other 2 decks that really kind of like knocked my socks off and blew me away in November was the Forest of Enchantment. And I've modded mine. I think I mod most of my decks. I do have a video on that. And the Angels and Ancestors, which of course I've modded as well. These 2 decks together work really beautifully. I really enjoyed working with the Forest of Enchantment. Okay, a lot of people have talked about the cardstock on this deck. I actually really like it, having worked with it for a while. It is like, it shuffles beautifully. It's holding up really well. I love that it's not super, super thick. I mean, I like the Hay House decks, but you know, this thick cardstock works on a smaller deck. It works on an Oracle because it's not like, it's not so big that I can't get my hands around it. When it comes to like Moonchild, that's too big for me. I love the Moonchild, don't get me wrong, but it's too big for me. What also really surprised me was kind of, this deck to me has a little bit of the Tarot of the Hidden Realms feel to me. Not in terms so much of the artwork, because it's a little bit more storybook-like, but this deck doesn't mess around either. It's very much, here's what you need to know. I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. This is just how it is. And I really enjoyed that about this deck. And then you pair that with the Angels and Ancestors, and I just really used this deck as you can see, the Angels and Ancestors was actually my focal point, and the Forest of Enchantment was actually gave me my messages around the central focus, which is not something that I usually do. So I was kind of switching things up, just playing around. So I would pull an Oracle card for my main focus, my main message, and then the Forest of Enchantment to expand on that message and to tell me what I need to know about it. And they worked really beautifully for that. And of course, just different art styles, but they both have that really earthy, very natural colors to them. But they also both kind of have that mystical, magical, wondrous place energy to it as well, which I really enjoyed. So these 2 were just wonderful. The Forest of Enchantment, I know everybody's been talking about it, but it's really surprised me at how much I actually like reading with it. I was expecting it to be kind of this, not really like a hug deck, but I was expecting it to just be like, oh, you know, here's your reading, kind of like the Tarot of the Green Witch. I mean, not too, I love that deck too, and I worked with it in November, but it's just more, Tarot of a Green Witch is more of an easy reader. This is very, very deep, and it had very serious messages, and that I wasn't expecting. So yeah, 2 definite favorites in my collection for sure. That is the Forest of Enchantment Tarot and the Angels and Ancestors Oracle. And finally, moving into December, we're not quite at the end of the month yet, so I'm actually not going to show you pages from my journal because I don't want to spoil that for my December journal page video. But I do want to talk about a couple of the decks that I used earlier this month that I actually really enjoyed working with. It's really no surprise for me. This is the Golden Tarot, and this deck I completely trimmed. I do have a mod on this, I think it's called Goodbye Gilding. It features this deck, The Influence of the Angels, and the Chronicles of Destiny, where I removed the gilding from those decks. This deck, I actually totally love borderless and without the titles or anything. I went back and forth about it. You can actually see that in the video. My whole, I don't know. And in the end, this is what I ended up doing with it. And I just absolutely love it like this. It reads so beautifully. I love the images and I love working with these 3 decks together. So that's the Golden Tarot. This one is, oh, I did edge it as well. Again, have a whole video on that. This is the Influence of Angels. Again, I edged this one because I trimmed the gilding off, and this one I kept the borders. I just trimmed off the gilding. And again, that's in that video if you want to take a look at it. I adored this deck. It's one of my favorites. I like decks like this. I don't know if it's, I mean, it's collage, but it's like historical collage. It feels like paintings. I don't know, I have a lot of decks like this actually, and I really enjoy working with them. I really enjoy the images. I really enjoy the messages. This one, I like that there's little angels in all of the cards. There's big angels in that one, but you can see here, there's little angels in all the cards, and sometimes paying attention to where those angels are can be a lot of fun in your readings with this deck. So I often use these 2 decks together, and then I pull, which I should probably edge this one too. This is the Divine Doors. And this is just a fun little tarot deck, little oracle deck. It pairs really beautifully with the with these 2 decks. I mean, you can see they just kind of look like they were made to go together. I love the little doors. I think doors are really cool. And on the back side, we have just really simple messages. They all pretty much, I think they all rhyme, which is really kind of cute. Offerings. Abundance lies in the heart that allows. Share more than expected and see love come around. Intuition. Simple, complex words of pain or that heal. You come to know truth by the way that it feels. It's just kind of fun, actually. But the messages are really great, and I really enjoy using these messages alongside these two decks, and it just makes for really wonderful readings. Using them all together is kind of my favorite to do with them, but I do actually mix and match them with other things as well. So I think that's all for me today. That was a look at my favorite decks that I worked with in 2019. If you want to see flip throughs of my journals, I do actually have a whole playlist of journaling videos. I also have playlists for my Mod With Me's where I talk about and show the modifications that I do to my decks. And I also have my monthly reflection videos where I talk about all the decks that I use each and every month. I hope you enjoyed this video of my favorite decks that I worked with in 2019. And I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.